So hello, how are you today?
Great.
So before we start, let me just say I do have a few magazines, including a few left of Tracing Female Ancestors. They're only $5. I'll take questions at the end since they are taping. I think that's easier. And so let's get started. You know, this is my favorite topic. I mean, this is it. And one of the reasons is, besides I have a background in women's studies, is I'm always amazed that in genealogy people don't want to research their female ancestors. You know, that just seems so strange to me. And so I want to give you some tools to kind of open up your thinking about how do you do this. Too often in genealogy we think in terms of government records, the census and BMD, birth, marriage, and death, and that kind of thing. But with women, you've got to be a little more creative. So we're going to talk about that today. See, I'm very messed up. So up?
Just further away. Yeah.
Down?
Yeah, further away from the
Okay.
source of the volume. Yeah.
The source of the volume. Right there? Yeah? Okay.
PC way to say that, huh?
That's right. I am the source. Okay. Okay, I've got too many things. So, why are women difficult to research? Well, because we have this vision of them, right? That all they did was housework and having children and making dinner and all of that. That's kind of like my everyday life. But in reality, women have always worked. And obviously those things are work as well. And when we look at women's lives, women did all kinds of things. Immigrant women, women of color, they had to work. And so there are those types of records. But even if they didn't have to work outside the home, they were connected in some way to societal groups. And so we have to look at that as well. This is my favorite quote, because it's one that I am seized with horror as well. If you can't see it, it's she was seized with horror at the idea of having to dedicate her entire life to housework. This is actually from a woman during the Civil War. So if you think women like to do that, that's not true. So there you go. Women have had opportunity throughout time to do things. During war, they worked outside of the home and they took over for men. They fought for their civil rights, like voting. And so all those things left records, and we need to think of women in terms of those historical events. The other thing, and I know this probably is a little difficult for some people to read, but let me explain it. When I think about women, and women are in the blue there, I put housewife. Even if she was a housewife, think of all the ways she's involved in her community, through her husband, or children, or father, or whoever. You know, if we think about church, which is up at the top left, there's auxiliaries, women's auxiliaries in churches. There's membership lists, periodicals, histories. Those all involve women. I'm going to show you one of my favorites a little later. What about her connection to people in her community, like midwives, or the local store, or a physician? And then on the right, what about things like when you're married, you're connected to your kids and their schools and their activities, or your husband, and he's a member of a fraternal order. So you're a member of one of those auxiliaries. You have to think in terms of her connections, and that leads to records. However, it's not easy. It's not something you just put in Ancestry or an online service and find. Because we tend to focus on things like the census, and we should, that's a great way to put somebody in place and time, we often ignore other records. And I'll tell you, the census doesn't have all the good information, right? I think about my great-grandmother, and she's highlighted, Mae Philibert. She lived in this area. She, in the census, is always a housewife. My great-grandmother was not a housewife a day in her life. But the city directory tells the real story. She worked in a laundry during the World War I years, and then later was a chef. So you have to go beyond just the census and use other records that list people in their name and time. So how do we do that? When we research women, we've got to research her in a few different ways. So first, we're going to research her as an individual, but then we're going to look at her family. And that includes if she's married, her husband and children and all of them, but it also includes her birth family. Some people leave better records than others. That's just a fact. So we have to look at all of that. Then we need to research her community. What's going on in the community? What church is there that she may have attended? What organizations existed that she may have been a part of? What's going on? And sometimes, depending on the time period, you can get that from city directories or even historical newspapers. All right? And then finally, you need to be cognizant of the historical era. What's going on in history? So let me give you an example. One government type of record is voter lists, right? But you might say, and next month actually is one of the anniversaries of the 19th Amendment, women didn't vote till 1920. When did women vote in California? Earlier. Yes. They voted earlier. And in fact, women in New Jersey were voting in 1790 if they were single and owned some land. But then when men figured that out, they decided, no, let's not do that. And so they changed the law. So different states, in fact, Wyoming really is the first state to give women statewide suffrage. That's why they're called the equality state. So you wouldn't want to ignore that because that's additional records that can be helpful for you. Now, as we research, I want you to be cognizant of three things because this is going to help you do better research. And this is for anything you do, okay? So I want you to have 2 keyword lists, and I'll talk about that in a second. I want you to have a timeline every time you research. And I can show you one example, but you need to do what you're going to do best, what you makes visually makes sense to you and that kind of thing. But you need a timeline because a timeline is going to show you where your gaps are. And then finally, you need to seek out archival collections. Now, as genealogists, we tend not to do that because archival collections take more effort, quite frankly. You have to actually go there. You have to go through lots of papers. They're not indexed typically, and it can take a lot of time. But that's where the genealogical gold is in those archival collections. So we're going to talk about all of that. So let's talk about keyword lists first, and let's talk about your first keyword list. Oops, hold on. Operator error. This is what happens when you get a computer. Okay. So keyword list number 1 has to do with, or keywords basically. And when we do archival research, that requires us to research differently than when we research on genealogy websites. So really, this is the most important thing I can tell you today. In genealogy, we tend to research using name, date, place, right? We plug that into Ancestry, Family Search, whatever, name, date, place. And that's great. That's how those databases are indexed. That is not how library and archival collections are cataloged. So instead, you need to sit down and think a little bit about the person you're researching. What was her occupation, if she had one? What was her religion? What groups did she belong to? What activities were happening in the area? You need to write all of those down. Because as we search library and archival catalogs, we need to look on some different words than her name. Because unless she was famous or infamous, her name's probably not going to pop up in the catalog. Okay? At the very least, your keywords should be the place that she lived or places that she lived in. And all the names for those places. Okay? So one of my books is called Cemeteries of the Eastern Sierra. So where's the Eastern Sierra? Bishop. Okay, that's a city in the Eastern Sierra. So I could list all the cities in the Eastern Sierra. I could also list the 2 counties, which is Inyo and Mono counties. There's also a regional name besides Eastern Sierra. It's called the Owens Valley. I need to write all of those down on my keyword list and search on all of those because I don't know what a particular facility cataloged their items as. And so I need to be prepared for that. So at the very least, write down every place she lived and do a search on that. Keyword list number 2 is variations of her name. Now, one of the women that I researched was a painter, and professionally, she always went by her initials, and let's see, her first married name, she had 2, and then she had her maiden name. But I find that when I go look for her in newspapers, she could be under all kinds of different names because it mattered what the article was about. Was it about her and her second husband? Was it about her painting career? Was it about her and her parents? They're all different names she used. So for an example, and you need to think about your person, let's say you start off with Mary Jane Brown, and that's her maiden name. But then she marries Carl G. Smith, so she becomes Mary Jane Smith. Now before marriage, she's Miss Brown, and I hate researching stuff like that. But then she's Mrs. Carl G. Smith, or Mrs. K. G. Smith, or Mrs. K. Smith, or just Mrs. Smith. That's even better, right? And then as she gets older, maybe people refer to her as something else, like Grandma Smith. So you have to be prepared for that and write that all down. Now notice I haven't even mentioned all the possible misspellings. And if you don't know what those could be, like with Smith, because we're adults, and right, we have in our mind Smith is spelled a certain way. Kids don't have that in their mind. So ask a kid, how do you think this is spelled? And see what they say. That might give you some ideas that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And obviously, as you research, you're going to come up with variations you stumble upon. So note those. I know that when I'm researching my painter, when I don't find her, it's because I haven't followed all those variations. And then when I say, oh, okay, let me look under her nickname, and sure enough, there's an article about her. So you need to be diligent when you research. You can't just put in one name and say, well, she's not there. Because we know during a certain time period, if she's married, she's probably not Mrs. her name Smith. She's probably Mrs. his name Smith. And we need to consider that. Now, what about a timeline? Now, you may use a genealogy software program that has timelines, and you just use that, and that's great. One of the ways I do a timeline, because it makes sense to me, is I either do it in a spreadsheet program, or I just do it with Microsoft Word, and I create a table in there. And the way I do it is my first column is the date of the event, whatever date that is. The census date, their birth date, whatever. The second column, I put the event. What is that event? The third column, I put in the comments. What do I want to say about this? She was living here. This is who she's with. Notice this. This seems different than in other mentions of her, all of that. Sometimes if it's a woman, I'll put in another column that gives the name that I found her under. Especially with my painter, that helps me see what name is she using during certain time periods. And then in my final column, I put the source citation. So when I put it away and come back in 6 months, I know where I found that information. And I just keep that on everybody I research. Because what I find is when I start getting stuck and I'm not sure where to go next, I can refer to this and say, oh, there's this big hole between these 2 years. Or why haven't I looked for her in 1920? Or was there a state census? And I can ask those questions. Now, I want to talk, as we explore where to find information, I want to start with familiar resources. And the reason is because they're familiar, right? But they're ones that you know, and I want to kind of explore how you should be using them differently. So let's talk about a few ones that you are familiar with, And what I'm going to encourage you to do with these familiar resources is go beyond the homepage search. Every genealogy site has a homepage search, and that's the kind of, hey, looky here, you can find something search, right? But that's not always the best place to search. You need to get to know the search engine. Do they allow wildcards? That's especially important if you've got a name that is misspelled a lot, or you're not really sure whether it's Kate or Catherine, any of that. If there's a keyword search, try it. See if that can help. Ancestry has keyword searches, Family Search does, they all do. And then you need to keep current on what they're doing, and I'm going to give you one example shortly. Subscribe to their blog, or to someone who likes to post about what's the newest database, or sometimes databases are new and sometimes they're taken away. And that's important to know. So if you're buying these subscriptions, you need to be on top of that and know how that subscription can help you. So let's talk about Family Search. Now, I've always said Family Search should be your first stop. And there's lots of reasons for that. However, there's going to be a caveat now. But in Family Search, when Family Search first started, there was a few databases, but it was mostly the library catalog. Today, it's the library catalog, which they now call the Family Search catalog, but it's also digitized books and historical records, and that's fabulous. All right? And to get there, if you don't know, you go to familysearch.org, you click on Search, and then you click on Catalog. And you come to this page. Now here's the problem. Family Search announced the other day that as of August 30th, they will not rent out microfilm anymore. So if there's microfilm, and I would encourage you to go look at microfilm, you need to do that as soon as possible. So why would you do that? Before you spend money of any kind or go anywhere, you should always exhaust the catalog. What have they already microfilmed or at this point digitized? And you do that by doing a place search. And you can do a place search on the state, you can do a place search on the county, you can even do the city, though obviously there's probably going to be fewer records on a city level. Now, they also allow you can do place and then you can do a keyword search. So you can do two searches at once. So let's say you want all the records that have to do with Quaker women in a certain place. You could put the place and then click on keyword and put Quaker. So you can combine those searches. My only warning is this. When you try to combine a whole bunch of searches, you're not going to get very many results because you're telling the catalog it has to meet all of these different criteria to be a relevant hit. So 2 is probably all you should do. Now, the other thing about Family Search, and we'll get to these, is on that right-hand side, it says, look, there's other catalogs for you to check out, including Worldcat, which is the library catalog for the world, and Archive Grid, which is archival collections for the world. So it doesn't matter that I typically do US research and you do Eastern European. Those two sources have stuff from all over the world. So I did a fairly poor search on women newspapers to see what was there. And I received 119 results and all kinds of different instances, mostly books that have to do with women in newspapers. In fact, my favorite is at the top. It's Index of References to American Women in Colonial Newspapers through 1800. Wow, if you're doing research on colonial women, that's the first thing I would look for. Now, if you do it later and there's no microfilm, all you have to do is click on there. There'll be a link for Worldcat, and it'll tell you the nearest library with that book. So keep that in mind. But there's all kinds of different things if you kind of open up the way you're researching. Here's another example, women homesteaders. And there's all kinds of records, histories, and so forth about women who were homesteaders. And maybe you have some female ancestors who homesteaded. One important thing to know about Family Search, and really this is every library catalog, is that in Family Search, they have, if you're looking at the item, so we're looking at land in her own name, women homesteaders in North Dakota, we scroll down and there's the subjects. Now, Family Search uses Library of Congress subject headings and their own subject headings. And their subject headings tend to be more place-oriented. So you can go down there, click on one of those links where my little arrow is. It will rerun the search, and it might find things that you wouldn't have found otherwise. So that's a really important feature of any library catalog that you use. Sometimes you know that, this is a horrible saying, but you don't know what you don't know. That's one of those instances where you can find out what you don't know. Now, another source that I think is extremely important that we don't take advantage of enough is digitized books. If you think about it, it used to be, right, in the good old days, we would always come to the library to look at books, and we were limited at that library by what they have. That makes sense. Or what they could order for us. Or you'd have to travel. But today, we have all kinds of options for digitized book websites online. So why wouldn't you use that? And they're free. So you're not limited by travel expenses or any kind of expense. You can do a nice search online and find things that way. And it's another instance where there's stuff out there in books about women that you would have never guessed in 100 years. So you need to do a search. Now, unlike our archival search or library search, these digitized book websites are every word digitized, or every word indexed. So you can search on a name. You don't have to do your keywords if you don't want. You can just do a name. And with Google Books, you can do what you would do with a really nice Google search, and you can use an exact phrase search. So let's say you're looking for Mary Jane Smith. You can put Mary Jane Smith in quotes, and then you could put Texas next to it, indicating you only want Mary Jane Smiths in Texas. Now, here's the problem if you choose to do that. If she is in a book as Mary Smith, you're not going to catch it. Or Mary J. Smith, or Mrs. Keith Smith, you're not going to get it. So you want to do several different searches. Let me also say about Google Books, if you do a search, if it is a book in the public domain, you can download it, you can save it on your computer, you can do all kinds of things. It's connected to Worldcat, and so you can even find out what place has this book. So it's a really nice tool that we should be using. It should be one of your first steps in doing your genealogy. And just some of the things they have on Google Books includes old DAR magazines. They have old ancestry magazines. They have all kinds of old periodicals. They have books of all kinds, including family histories, place searches, all of that, city directories, everything. You find a city directory on Google Books, you can do another search within that city directory to find all instances of a specific name. So why wouldn't you use that? So use those tools. Now, one other digitized book website is Internet Archive, which is also fabulous. And it's fabulous because not only do they have a large library collection for both the US and Canada, but they also have a huge genealogy collection. Lots of items from Allen County Public Library, which is one of the largest genealogy libraries in the United States. They even have a microfilm collection. So you go to their front page, which looks like this, and you see that that first little icon is an open book. It's orange. You click on that. That's their text collection. Those are the digitized books. Now, when you go in there, it has like a Pinterest feel. You go in there and you can click on American Libraries, or you could click on Additional Collections. Once you click on Additional Collections, you can then click on Genealogy. And there are over 100,000 items from Allen County, from University of Toronto, BYU, right there that you can use. My only warning about using Internet Archive is this. I find it more useful if you do a search once you kind of get down to what you want, like a specific collection. I find it less useful to do your search right there from the home page. So kind of play around with it. Go to American Libraries, choose a specific library if you want. Go to the microfilm collection. They have censuses and Revolutionary War stuff in that microfilm collection. So just kind of go in there and start exploring. When we think about women, and I'm going to show you one example, they have a whole collection on cookery and cookbooks. And lots of community cookbooks in there. Now, newspapers are the great equalizer. Newspapers don't care if you're rich or poor, if you're good or really bad, right? They document it, especially in smaller communities. And so newspapers should always be one of your first places to go and check out what you can find. Whether that, in some cases, we often think of women in terms of things like birth, marriage, and death announcements. But there's other things as well, including when there's membership organization meetings, she might be listed in that. There might be things like milestone events in her life. For example, a 50th wedding anniversary or more, right? They always have those, and they ask the couple, how have you stayed together so long, right? I always like that. Or if you were quite elderly, 90, 100, they start putting articles about you and your longevity. So there's all kinds of reasons to find articles about women. Now, the tricky part is they're everywhere. So you have to identify where's the newspapers that I need, and are they online? They may not be. You might have to go to a repository, you might have to go and get microfilm or some other access method. Then you have to think about the way you search. Yes, we can do our name search, and that's great, but remember we need to go through all our name variations. We should do our keyword search as well, and don't make assumptions. I find when people make assumptions, that's when they make mistakes with research. So, don't make assumptions like, well, my person was a farmer's wife, she never did anything. Lots of farmers' wives do all kinds of stuff. So you need to just go in and see what you can find and not assume what you may find. So with women, we're talking about vital record mentions, both for her and her husband's obituary, her children. We're talking about wedding anniversaries, typically anything after 25 years. Church auxiliaries, if she was involved in a church auxiliary and they had a meeting or some kind of event. Membership groups are the same. Recipes. Women turned in their recipes, especially during times like war. When there was, in World War I, there wasn't enforced rationing, but there was rationing encouraged. And so women would write in and give their cookie recipes for not using flour, for example. So you might find things like that, or that they won a recipe contest. Advertisements. If your female ancestor owned a business, or was in an advertisement for losing something like a lost and found. I've seen women who were in the advertisements because their husband was going to divorce them and didn't want to pay her debts anymore, right? So there's all kinds of reasons to be in there. In fact, I'll tell you, you all know who Lydia Pinkham is? So she had her elixir that cures all that women have. You can still buy that today. Lydia Pinkham was a genius in marketing, and she actually, when women would write to her and say, oh, I used to be so tired and now I've got so much energy and I can do everything. She would actually put their photo or an illustration of that person and their name and address in the newspaper. I wish I could find something like that. And then, of course, there's the legal notices in the newspaper that you could be in for everything from not paying your taxes to being sued, to land, to probate matters. So here's two examples. And, depending on the newspaper, obviously bigger newspapers are going to have less of the kind of hometown feel. But this first one is Women's Relief Corps. That was an auxiliary to the Grand Army of the Republic. Those were Civil War soldiers. So their wives, daughters, so that's that. If I had a Union soldier, I would look to see if he was in the GAR, and then I would look to see if the wife, there were several different auxiliaries to the GAR. And then, of course, there's different kinds of personal or gossip columns where women it would mention that they went to a meeting or they went shopping or, whatever. Now, where do you find newspapers? People always ask me, what newspaper subscription should I get? And I always tell them I have no idea. And I'll tell you why. And I'll be honest, I do write for Genealogy Bank. However, you need to go to these websites and see what newspapers they have for the place and time period that you're researching. If they don't have what you need, then you shouldn't subscribe to it. But the problem is that that's changing every month. And they digitize millions of pages each month. So what they don't have today, they may have next week. And you could even call and say, hey, are there any plans to digitize newspapers in Kansas? Each site has its strengths. So for example, newspapers.com actually has some Canadian newspapers. Genealogy Bank has African American newspapers. They have German language newspapers that were published here in the US. They have Jewish newspapers that were published in the US, Hispanic. So there's some of that, but they're only the US. So you need to look and see which one works for you. Now, one way you could do this to kind of start off your search is going to Chronicling America, which a lot of people are familiar with, but I'm going to tell you something important. Chronicling America is with the Library of Congress. These are free digitized newspapers in the US, but they're not every state. So once again, you've got to look to see if it's the state that you need. Now, probably the most important thing about this is over on the right-hand side, kind of the top, there's this long pink button. And it says Newspaper Directory 1690 to present. So you click on that. That's a directory of newspapers. That's not what's on Chronicling America, though some of them are. That's an overall directory for the US. Now, are there some things missing? Yeah. But you go in there, you search by place, and it tells you the different titles of newspapers. It tells you when they were published and where they're located. If you don't know what newspapers existed where your ancestor lived, and maybe you make assumptions, you should double check that and see for sure. And then see where is it. Now, maybe it's only on microfilm at a local college, so then you might have to hire someone. But it's good to find out. In some cases, states or other places have digital newspaper projects, and this is the one for the state of California. And that's run out of the UC Riverside, so down in Southern California. And they have some new features they just introduced, but you can look on there. They have a lot of San Francisco newspapers, for example. They have older public domain newspapers that they have digitized. Even if you have access to these newspapers through another source, sometimes it's good to use a second source because sometimes maybe you find something different because of the search engine, for example. And then Find My Past, which originally started as a UK genealogy site, but now they're increasingly having more US records, has two things you want to be aware of. They have a great newspaper collection. That includes British newspapers if you're doing UK research. They also have something that we don't use a lot anymore, and sometimes I think we need to go back to the way we researched a long time ago, and that is PERSI, the Periodical Source Index. You get to that by going to Find My Past, clicking on Search Records, and then clicking on Newspapers and Periodicals. So there it is. And so this is the home page, and it has the newspapers. Oh, sorry, hold on. Now, at the kind of right before it says US, it says Periodical Source Index. Now, the Periodical Source Index is done by Allen County Public Library, and that's in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And it is an index of magazines from genealogy and historical journals, magazines, periodicals that are in English and also in French. Some are from French Canada. And so these are indexed typically by the title and the subject. However, Find My Past is trying to digitize those to make it easier to access. So you would go in there and do a search. Now, you have to order the original article from Allen County Public Library, and the instructions are on Find My Past. If you don't have a Find My Past subscription, you can access it at a family history center. Let's talk about manuscripts. Now, I told you about archival collections. And archival collections are items that were not meant or never were published. And so those are housed in archives. And so you have to search by keyword. You got to think about your variant spellings. And you've got to look at catalogs for archives. Now, although this is not an archival catalog, I want to bring it up because they do have some archival collections and they have the books, which we want. And that is Worldcat. Now, remember your keyword list. You're going to search that in the white area there. And you're probably going to search by place to kind of see what there is. So wherever she lived, or if she was a member of the Women's Relief Corps, or anything like that, you want to search in there. Everything, that's right. You want to search everything. And not only books, they also have archival collections. The other catalog I want you to be aware of that genealogists don't use is this one. It's called Archive Grid. Very similar to Worldcat, but it's the world's archives. So once again, we're going to use our keyword search, and we're going to search at the very top there. Now, something you need to be aware of with archives. Archival stuff ends up in weird places. So let's say I go to a thrift store or something and I buy a bunch of membership records for Maine, but I live in California. And I decide, you know what, this needs to benefit everybody. And I went to the Claremont School of Theology, so I'm going to donate to them. Well, that makes no sense, right? But that's archival stuff ends up in strange places. So don't make the assumption that everything you're looking for is going to be in the place you're researching. It could have ended up somewhere else. So we do our keyword search, we hit search, and then see what comes up. Membership records, correspondence, scrapbooks, all kinds of great stuff. The other thing that's important to remember about this is people are always adding to this catalog. So you have to go and rerun your search later and see if any new things have been added. So in this case, I did a search for the Dorcas Society. Is there any members of the Dorcas Society here? Okay. So this is a Christian benevolent group, and they sew. And they do different items that they sew and they give to people who are poor. So it has existed since the 1800s, and so I got 214 results. That would have been a group that Christian women would have been a member of, or one of the many, and it tells me about the different record collections. So that first one says it's from 1811 to 1875. It's in Salem, Massachusetts, or it's for Salem, Massachusetts. It's at a museum, and it's one box. But it includes meetings, account books, all kinds of great stuff. These are rich in names, dates, and places. And what do we look for in genealogy? Names, dates, places. And this isn't going to be on Ancestry next week. Now, Internet Archive, which we talked about, also has other kinds of books. And the California State Library even has a page on Internet Archive. So instead of going down the street, you could go on Internet Archive instead. Less parking hassle. And so they have all kinds of things, including periodicals and other items that they have digitized, and they're constantly digitizing and adding more. We like digital collections, right? We like genealogy subscription sites. We like all of that because of the ease of use. But sometimes there's collections that we're not as familiar with. When we think about women, we have to think about what did they leave behind? What is specific to women? And so some collections are specific to women. So let's say you have an ancestress who came to California after the gold rush, right? After about 1848. What was that like? What was it like to come over a trail and come to a new state? See, it's the stories that make people interested in genealogy. It's not that name, date, and place stuff that we're hooked on. It's the actual stories. And although she may not have left a diary, someone else did. And that might give you some ideas about what was that experience like. So for example, Duke University in their digital collections has women travel diaries. Some of them are more recent, like the 30s, for example, the 1930s. Others are back from the 1800s. If you had an ancestor who worked, maybe she worked in the mills, maybe she did all kinds of stuff. Gosh, did factory work. Yesterday I gave a talk where I talked about that one of the biggest industries for women in the early 1900s was cigar factories. So you can go to this Harvard collection called Women Working 1800 to 1930, and there's all kinds of things, including women's magazines of the times, that can give you an idea about what was life like during this time. Now, I should tell you this. In genealogy, we tend to focus on just getting information about that one person. But in order to really understand her life and to understand what records might exist, you have to go beyond that. And you have to think like a historian. And so it's helpful to look at period newspapers, period periodicals, magazines, and other things that can give you that social history perspective. Now, in order to truly understand women's lives and try to find them, we sometimes have to look at what did they leave behind. So what did women leave behind? Well, they left behind quilts, and they left behind cookbooks, and sometimes they left behind journals and other correspondence. So we need to look for those. That's different than we typically do in genealogy when we're looking for government records. Now, some of my favorite places to research, and we don't tend to do this, is academic libraries. And at academic libraries, they have subscriptions that we don't have access to as individuals or even at a public library. So one example is this one, which is Alexander Press, North American Women's Letters and Diaries. And they have all kinds of stuff in there from women during those time periods. So seek out your local academic library for what subscription sites they have that can help you. And that includes newspapers. Typically, those academic libraries have wonderful newspaper sites that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. Now, one of my favorite things to do with academic libraries is to ask them questions. And UC Riverside is near me. You pay taxes, I think, maybe. So you are supporting our California universities, so why not try to use the libraries? So on their websites, they typically have a feature called Ask a Librarian, where you can click on it when they're there, when it's during operating hours, and you can ask questions, including things like, what newspaper collections do you have? What subscription sites do you have? Do you have anything for the local history? Remember that a university has historians. They do research, and a lot of times they have archives and other materials having to do with local history. So that's one of the first places I always look for when I'm doing research, is I look at the place I'm researching and what academic institutions exist there, and what does my local academic library have. I'll tell you, in the case of UC and Cal State schools, you can often get either a community card or an alumni card, and it doesn't matter that you're not an alumni there. And then you can use their databases. You usually can't use them from home, but they also allow you to check out books. So you have to make a contribution. Where I live, it's not very much. I know Berkeley is $100 a year, so that's a little more pricey. But that's something you might want to consider, especially if you're really focused, you want to get a lot of research done on specific newspapers, for example. The difference is that a women's manuscript collection is authored by women, or it has mostly to do with women. So women's groups, or it could be a man and all his daughters and all his daughters' diaries or something. So that's kind of the difference. So when I went there, I did a search. Now, my maternal grandmother grew up in a place called Snowflake, Arizona. It's in the White Mountains of Arizona. And so I put in Snowflake to see what would happen. And I got a collection from, authored by a woman named Mae Louise Larson. Now, she is not related to me in any way. But this collection that probably was donated by her descendants includes all kinds of different folders. Some of them are her writings. She did some historical writing and, you know, different things like that. So just her stuff, right? And I should say manuscript collections, the nice thing about archives is they always give you kind of a finding aid and what's in there. They're not going to tell you everything that's in there or give you all the names, but it's going to give you a little biography of the person and then tell you kind of there's 5 folders and there's letters in this folder and there's a diary in this folder and that kind of thing.
Detail.
In this case, one of the folders, the 4th folder, included 21 handwritten pages of a birthday book where she kept all the birth dates and names of people in the Snowflake Stake in Arizona. So let me explain that. In the LDS Church, a stake is, it's a designation for how big, it's more than a ward, it's a stake, it's just bigger. In Snowflake, everybody's Mormon. She kept a birthday book of everybody's birth date in town. That's where you could go. Now, is that an official record? No, of course not. But that's a clue. And so that's what manuscript collections have. I've seen them have letters. I've seen them have birthday books or scrapbooks. They have all kinds of things, and they're just waiting to be explored. One of the things for those who went to Jamboree, if anybody did, is I gave a talk on my research on repatriation. During the early 1900s, women who married men who were not U.S. citizens lost their citizenship. Men who married women who were not citizens, nothing happened to them. The woman actually got citizenship. But so U.S. women lost their citizenship. At the National Archives in Riverside, by where I live, they have the court records from when the women, after 1923, 1930s, they started asking for their citizenship back. They had to fill out an oath and provide proof that they were originally U.S. citizens. The way they did this was by providing birth certificates, death certificates for their husband, marriage certificates, affidavits from their parents, that kind of thing. Well, the courthouse in Southern California kept those things. And so when I was doing this research, I would open it up and there'd be like a marriage book where it had everybody who went to this woman's wedding, for example. Things, and that's not true for all, I'm not saying that's true for all National Archives. National Archives, if you ask them, they do not have vital record information. It just so happens this collection does. But that's the importance of archival collections. They have treasures like that, and you're not going to know unless you make an effort to go see them. Historical societies are the same, and they often have archival collections. And when you think societies, think in terms of there's a state historical society, there might be a regional historic society, there's county historic societies, there's historic societies for various occupations or religions. So there's all kinds of historical societies. And often they will have women's manuscript collections. So when you're researching, write down where did she live. And then identify all the libraries, all the genealogy and historical societies, the museums, and then start seeking out those catalogs. Now, quilts are another way that women are, that's what they leave behind. This is actually a quilt that I've talked about before. In fact, someone's heard me give this talk. This is a quilt top that some women at a cigar factory in the early 1900s put together, and it includes the women who worked at the cigar factory. Now, you may think, well, that's an obscure source. Where am I supposed to get that? Well, signature quilts, yeah, they're a home source, but there actually are big repositories of quilt collections. And one of them is an index online called the Quilt Index. And they have the names of women who are on signature quilts that you can search right then. So you go to the Quilt Index. They have a search on just makers, but they also have the signature quilt search. Now, I'll tell you, I really believe in this because one day I was doing a search and an uncle lived in a very small town in Nebraska. And the local Methodist church, I don't even know if there's other churches there, there's like 50 people there. They did a quilt for the physician in town who was retiring. He had obviously helped with all the births of all the babies, right? The women did a quilt where they put butterflies, and each block had the name and birth year of somebody who had been born in that town. That's on this site. It's searchable by every name on the quilt. In fact, there it is. So each of these little quilt blocks is a little butterfly, and it has the name of the child and the birth year. That is totally searchable. Major quilt collections include Lincoln, Nebraska. Daughters of the American Revolution has a huge collection. Now, what about recipes? This is one of my, I hate this recipe, right? If somebody wanted to make me tuna casserole, I would run the other way. The only thing I like about this recipe is it has Velveeta, and I like Velveeta for some wacky reason, but yeah, so we think about what women did, and I told you that there's recipes in newspapers where women would provide that, or they would ask questions, and their name would be there in the newspaper. But what about community cookbooks? Community cookbooks, and I bet a lot of women in this room have donated to a community cookbook or helped put one together, are fundraising cookbooks. And you provide your recipes and it's sold for whatever amount, and it supports a church or a school or organization. Those cookbooks have been around since the Civil War. So lots of people have done that, right? And I told you on Internet Archive, they actually have a collection of these. There's other collections as well. They not only provide us names and dates, they provide us, what she was involved in. They provide us her best recipes, even if it's tuna casserole. But it's a city directory of women. Think about it. What's a city directory? Names, it's a date, it's a place, and there's ads. That's what's in old community cookbooks as well. Because the money was made by selling the cookbook, but also by selling ads. So here's just a fun example. So this is from Evanston, Illinois, and it's all about this bank, and it's called Banking for Women. That's separate than Banking for Men. All you men, you don't know this, but we do secret things in the bank. So this is about 1920s-ish, and it says, banking for women is nowadays not only a business necessity, but also a distinct pleasure. Is that a pleasure for you? In an institution such as this, which affords every facility for the accommodation of its lady patrons. An attractively furnished restroom containing desks, stationery, telephone is at your disposal. Have you ever tried to use anything at the bank lately? So it gives you that social history to help you better understand what's going on. And I'll tell you, in community cookbooks, I've seen ads for the local funeral director. I've seen ads for physicians, for cemeteries. That tells me what's going on during the time she lives there. Yeah, I know funeral director and cookbook doesn't seem like a good idea, but... So here's my best example of this. This is on Internet Archive, and it's called Historic Paxton, Her Days and Her Ways, 1722 to 1913. And you see it says family recipes contributed by the Women's Aid Society of Paxton Church. So that's delightful, wonderful. The first section is history. The second section is recipes and all of that. But the best thing in this cookbook, and I challenge all of you who are putting one together, you need to do this as well, is a whole chapter on the cemetery, including people buried there and photos. Cookbooks are important resources, but because they take a little bit more to find, we often discount them. But now with digitized book websites, it's getting easier and easier. You just go to Internet Archive or Google Books. You do a search on the place you're researching and the word cookbook, and see what comes up, or the religion, or suffrage, or whatever, and see what comes up. Or if you're visiting the place, you go to the Friends of the Library bookstore, you go to the library, you go to the thrift store. There's all kinds of places that have those community cookbooks. So that's another thing that you can do to add to finding out more about your female ancestor. Now, do I know this is difficult? Yes, absolutely I do. But sometimes when we get to a certain point where we've exhausted everything else that we've tried, you have to be a little more creative. Now, just so you know, on my website, or on my blog, Gena's Genealogy, I do every year something for Women's History Month, and this is actually 2016, and it was 30 tips in 30 days. This year I did World War I women, and I did a tip or a little story every day about what women did during World War I, because I want to encourage you to write those stories down and to remember those women. For some reason we don't think about World War I very much, and we at all, do we? Yeah, and it's a centennial. And so when I think about World War I, I think about, how many of you had a Salvation Army person who gave out donuts in France? How many people had a nurse in their family because of the Red Cross and their call for nurses? If you have a DAR person, they were buying chickens for people in France because France was starving to death, and they used to give a little button about that. That would say, I have a chicken in France, yeah. So you need to write those stories down. And so I try to provide some of those tools on my blog. All right, questions? Yeah.
I have ancestors who was a soldier
Okay.
in Wyoming Territory in the 1870s, and they were married there at the fort by a priest.
Okay.
The wife was Roman Catholic, and the husband was a Mason.
Okay.
Those seem to be opposite.
Not necessarily. I mean, if you're Catholic, you've got Knights of Columbus and stuff, but they did have some fraternal order.
Wouldn't that be opposing him being a Mason, she being a Roman Catholic? That would be
A lot of couples don't believe in the same stuff as the other person, right? Right? Catholics marry Jews and the whole bit. So I don't think that that's that unusual. What it says to me is, now you need to look for Catholic Church records, you need to look for fraternal order records, and if she did say, okay, I'll be part of one of the auxiliaries, you need to look at that too. People who were Masons often were other things as well, like Oddfellows, and so you might want to look at that. So to me, that says, let's do some archival research, and there's lots to offer you for that. But yeah, there's people who are complete opposites that get married. What the heart wants, the heart gets, right? Yeah.
I just wondered, Gena, if you had any hints. The courthouse in El Dorado County burned.
Yes.
And the Huntington Library has some El Dorado County records, which I was kind of surprised to hear.
Yeah.
But it says we have 5 boxes. So to me, that means they're not indexed.
No.
You don't know what's in there. If you contact Huntington, will they tell you what's in there, or how do you start on it?
So this is Huntington and San Marino, right?
Right.
Okay, so here's the problem with Huntington. And I'd have to look at the page you're looking at. My understanding is Family Search is trying to digitize those. Because I told somebody about those records, and they did some stuff with Family Search, and they talked to them. So my understanding is those might be being digitized right now. The problem with the Huntington is they have a fabulous Western Americana collection. It's a private library. And so you cannot research there unless you have a PhD or you're recommended by a PhD. So there's the problem. But with a collection like that, they may allow you to see those. So what I would do is I would contact and give them exactly what you're looking at and what you want, because they also have some old LA County Court records as well. And so I would ask them what the procedure is to use, if you can.
Well, do they allow, if I paid somebody to go there and?
Typically, no, but if they'll allow anybody to look at it and they don't have that reader, what they typically require, then maybe. So, now I researched there a long time ago, and that was what you had to do. And I've talked to people since then if those are still the restrictions. But I know the collection you're talking about, I think they may be more open with that collection, because that really is a collection that should be open to all of us. So, so I would call and find out. Yeah, and then just go from there and ask them. It might be being digitized. So, yeah.
Recently, I wrote to I forget the exact name, Soldiers and Sailors Museum
Okay,
is it Pittsburgh?
okay.
And then I also wrote to Yale Library. For specific information I wrote, and this was on a website where it actually had, you could email us.
Yeah, yeah.
So it wasn't like I was just calling a librarian.
Sure, sure.
And I wrote all specific information down on both these sites, and I haven't heard a word. It's been
Okay, so
months.
it's been months, okay.
Months.
So then what I would do is I would try again. And this is a good question, because often as genealogists, we're passionate about our family history, right? But no one else is, including some of our family, right? So you have to be very careful about how you approach those things. So I know you're saying you were specific, but it needs to be short and specific. Do you have this? Can anyone have access to this? And kind of leave it at that. So then you can plan your next, what do I do next? But I would contact them and I'd say, I emailed, I haven't received a response. Does it typically take a few months? And just ask them that way and then try again. So, yeah.
In regards to that, some places in the Youngstown Public Library in Ohio, they do have people, and you can put in genealogy questions you ask, looking for information such as person, their obituaries, but don't give them a lot at once.
Yeah.
Just they say, give us 3 and we'll handle that, and then you can go again later and give them some more requests.
Yeah, just do a little bit at a time. And just, do you have this? Who can access it? And just be very specific. I think because we are so passionate, we give too much information, or we think everybody would be interested in our research, and people aren't. So, right?
And another thing, if you find something on Worldcat and you really want to get this book, and the closest library, whether it's like 500 miles away, go to your local public library for interlibrary loan.
Yep.
And if you've got a contact with like a university, and I'm a former Sac State library action employee, use that first, because I think that the things that aren't a lot of them, or the genealogy, they're more apt to send it to a university that is all public library.
Yeah. And I'd say be persistent. I wrote to a historical society about an obit, and about 3 weeks later I said, hey, did you have a chance to look for that obit? And then a week later they said, oh yeah, we're looking for it, and I'm still waiting 2 months later. So you have to just keep looking. Yeah.
With regard to the recipes and
Yes.
the books that are created,
Yes.
how, if we come across a bunch of them, how do we retrieve them and save them, and where do we put them?
Well, and even if you have a collection,
Yeah.
you can obviously digitize them if that's what you want to do, scan them and put them in your computer. If it's mentions of your person, I would definitely do that.
Okay, these were just literally boxes of recipe books.
Uh-huh.
They had the creator's name on it and the geographic area where they're from.
Yeah.
Would I send them to Duke? Would I scan them and send them to Duke?
Well, you always have to ask first if they want them. And there are several culinary collections around the country. So, for example, Harvard Schlesinger Library has a culinary collection. There's one at University of Michigan. There's one in Texas that I can't think of which one it is. It might be Texas Women's University. So you want to ask them, show them photos, show them what it is. Obviously, if you want something, you should scan it. That's the best way to preserve something. But I would go specifically to a culinary collection and ask them if they're for a certain area. Then you might want to contact a university or a historical society and just start asking if somebody would be interested in.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes.
When you were talking about the women's manuscript collection in Provo, Utah, where in Provo, Utah? Was it Brigham Young?
Brigham Young University.
You were associated or are associated with Genealogy Roadshow?
I researched the first season.
Oh, okay. Well, I went to the site and filled out the application, and I didn't hear anything last year. Is there a certain thing you should do or put down so that you're more likely to be selected for the show?
I think in terms of thinking about TV shows, there's several layers before. I mean, if you knew how many stories they start with, and by the time, you go through all these different layers, they're looking for specific things for each season, and sometimes that might be a place, and your story isn't in that place, so it's not going to be chosen. So that's probably what's the issue, is
so they start out
they're
with
looking
the
for
agenda.
specific places. And then they look at the stories, and then they look at how much research, and so there's a lot before you get to that point, and most of it's stuff you're not going to know. So I don't even know if they know in the next season where they're going to film.
Is there a schedule someplace where they show which cities they're going to be in?
I don't know. You can look on their website. Yeah, and see. And then remember, by the time they're announcing that, they probably have the stories already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two things. One, a small quip. The tuna chicken casserole
Yes.
recipe did not have tuna as an ingredient.
Yes, I know. That's even more horrifying, isn't it?
Not even a little thingy that said,
I know.
may substitute tuna for the
I know. Oh, I know.
And the other question is not really researching genealogy, but it's finding a home for items that maybe you don't want to keep anymore.
Yes.
And who to ask if there's any general interest. I have from maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, quilts that my great aunt and grandmother made. I mean, one of interest that was made for me as a teenager. But I have, 5 quilts and some other things that were homespun sort of thingies that were put on the beds. And I even have a item I'd have to think of the date, but the story is that it was woven by slaves and then cut in half because the sisters could not decide who was going to get it. I have both halves now.
Yeah.
They died. They came to me, the one that wants the genealogy.
Well, this is a good question in general. Yes, because obviously we're all going to shake off this mortal coil at some place. So where does the stuff go? And I think about this too. I have a lot of quilts because I research them, and my teenage boys don't care about quilts, right? So in the case of quilts, I would look at the International Quilt Study Group, for example, in Lincoln, Nebraska. They have a museum. They have an archive. I would talk to them. I would maybe look at the place that the person was from and see if the Historical Society wants them. The one thing you have to remember about donating items, and this kind of upsets people, is they might say, great, we'll take them. But then they may use them to barter for other stuff, or they may never show them ever. So they make you sign a form that basically says you realize that they may be in storage forever, and they never see the light of
But
day.
it's out of my closet.
But it's out of your closet, yes.
The light of day.
That's right, yes.
Oh, we had some dolls and we
we asked the reservation in Fort Hall, Idaho,
Yeah.
because they're not California native dolls. They were Plains Indians, and they're museum too.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a friend, he donated his father's World War II uniform to the local historical society. And they gratefully took it, and he gave a history with it and the whole bit, and he had to sign a form saying that it may never come out of their closet. But it's out of his closet. So, yeah.
Not a question, but a comment. Ancestor Hunt is a great site
It is.
for finding newspapers.
It is.
And Kenneth Marks is one-man operation, like Cindy's list is one woman.
Yep.
But he's got newspaper collections by state, city, county, down to historical societies, and he keeps it up to date. So
He does,
And
and-
he also has great tutorials on that
He
site.
does. And what I would say is remember to look at the Ancestor Hunt, not Ancestor Hunt, because that is a separate website. So always make sure to have the, but you're absolutely correct.
Kenneth Marks is the
Yeah,
guy that has
Kenneth
it.
Marks,
And you
yeah.
have two great quilt experts right here.
I know, we talked about my quilt, yeah.
Kind of along the line of where to donate things. I don't know if anybody was aware, but this past Thursday at the Elks Lodge on Riverside in Sacramento, there was a young man who is in charge of this million-letter project, and they are taking either originals or they'll take photocopies if you don't want to give up the originals. Letters written from anybody dealing with the military.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
It could be a person who actually served, it could be somebody who volunteered during World War II, was what, Donut Dolly or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Any of those letters, they will take, and I want to say that the website was warletters.us, and in fact, one of the gentlemen who came had a box, huge box of his uncle's letters.
Wow.
Thousands of letters. And so they will take anything as long as it's related with a letter. You know, they'll take uniforms or artifacts.
But you have to
But
have
you
a correspondence
letter
with it.
That, you know, even if the letter doesn't pertain to that particular item. And this gentleman has done things on PBS, not genealogy, but different PBS programs. But
Oh,
it's
okay.
a project that he's
Very
very
cool.
interested in. And he had copies of letters even from the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
that turned in. And
Okay.
he had a couple of samples. They are archiving them and they're donating them to Chapman University, which will
Okay.
archive them because he got to the point where he couldn't.
Yeah, it's too much.
do this. But just to let people know that if they have letters, especially distant relatives, that they may not
Yeah.
need the letters.
That they don't need to save.
I don't mean to hijack your...
Sure.
But my name is Kathy Wells. I'm the second vice president of the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society. So if you thought this was wonderful and you could hear her for an hour, imagine you will hear her all day.
Well, all day.
All day. So on October 21st, we are having our Finding Your Female, I don't know if I'm duplicating what you already said, Finding Your Female Ancestors. It's going to be in Pleasant Hill. It's not that far. If I came up from Concord, y'all can come down. It's on Saturday.
And I did too.
Free parking. And her name was not unknown, and she's going to tweak it. Make
Yeah,
it
it's going to be totally different.
a little different, so it's not like you're reading the same thing. Wives, widows, spinsters, and mistresses, The Secret Lives of Women, and I'm in the book. So if you want to just say, oh, I just can't get enough of her, and
And you want to hear about researching mistresses. Okay, so let's take a few more. Yeah, go ahead.
I was talking a couple of years ago to the textile curator at Winterthur in Delaware.
Yeah.
And she made the comment that if a museum is going to take your object, they frequently want money.
That's a good point, yeah, because it's not free,
All
yeah.
museums, from the biggest to the smallest, the little local historical societies are hurting
Both
now.
are hurting, but they'll take it without money, but yeah. But
Some will,
Yes.
some will,
Yeah.
but others will.
To help curate it and stuff, sure.
And a good, heavy donation.
Sure.
Helps.
Okay, so let's do 2 more before we get kicked out.
Gina, I just wanted to mention, we have a place here in Sacramento that's called the Sacramento History Center, and it's located on Pacific Avenue, I think it's out by B Street, out in that area, and they take objects. They've got chairs, they've got antiques, they've got dolls.
So there's all kinds of places,
They've got games, they've got all kinds of things, and so that's
The Center for Sacramento History is down off of Richards Boulevard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pacific. The big storage, I mean, they have a huge amount there, but there's a lot of stuff out of the common.
Fabulous.
But the paperwork is at.
It's somewhere else, yeah. Okay, all right. Okay. I answer.